Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the introductory remarks for this session. I know that people are still coming in. There's wonderful coffee and cookies outside, but hopefully people get those quickly. My name is Bebout. I teach in the English department here at Arizona State University, and I'm very happy to be able to moderate what I think is going to be a profound and important session in the conference today. For this panel, the organizers have identified a select group of participants who they have identified as voices for an up-and-coming generation of Armenians who are working for two aims. First, there is a challenge and the responsibility of bearing witness to a past marred by genocide, a past carried now and for future generations. The struggle for recognition continues, even 100 years later. Second, there is a promise of the future and the cultural rebirth that surviving generations hold as a privilege and as a unique opportunity, whether that is through the rebirth of art, the foundation of Armenian studies departments and universities, or the presence of a new generation of Armenian voices. In entitling this panel From the Ashes, the organizers of the conference recognize the unique and meaningful symbolism of this place in time. In Phoenix, 100 years since the Armenian genocide began. Okay, with that, I'm going to actually introduce each of the speakers, or actually a collective of speakers, but I'll introduce them each before the separate presentations begin. Each of them will have approximately 20 minutes, and then we should have 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A afterwards. Professor Patty Ferguson-Bohnee. She is a faculty director of the Indian Legal Program at ASU's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. Patty Ferguson-Bohnee is a professor at ASU, and she has worked in Indian law, election law, and policy matters, voting rights, and status clarification of tribes. As a Fulbright scholar to France, Professor Ferguson-Bohnee researched French colonial relations with Louisiana Indians in the 17th and 18th centuries, and she is a member of the Pointe-Genocide Indian tribe.
Ferguson-Bohnee. I'm from the Pointe-Genocide tribe in South Louisiana. Has anyone ever heard of the Pointe-Genocide tribe? Thank you, sir. We're very small. We're about 700 people. And the perspective that I'm going to share is the perspective from my tribe as survivors of lots of challenges over the years, starting with the French. And the questions that I want to try to address are, why does recognition matter, and why do we fight for it? And I think that the answers are both legal and psychological and emotional, as plays out with my tribe. Okay. Just by way of background, my tribe has occupied the Gulf Coast region since time immemorial. We're not currently recognized by the federal government as an Indian tribe. There's a list that the government creates. There are 566 federally recognized tribes. There's over 200 unrecognized tribes. And there are bundles of rights that are recognized as part of that federal acknowledgement. Our tribe, during the French period, was enslaved by the French. We're also, the French went to war with our tribe, and so they told other tribes if you harbored us that there would be repercussions, so they would either kill us or turn us back into the French. And the French did take other native slaves during this time period. After a while, that didn't work out too well because the Indians would run away, and even some coastal tribes committed suicide by walking to the Gulf of Mexico because they could not be slaves and live in that fashion. When Spain purchased Louisiana, they banned the slavery of Indians, so there was a little bit of change, but there wasn't a lot of development of Louisiana. Like, a lot of colonists weren't going to live there. So actually tribes were recognized as they were during the colonial period as independent governments, and they wanted tribes to fight with them against all of these other colonial powers in the southern United States. And so at one point there's a struggle between the English, French, the U.S. with regards to who would occupy certain parts of what is now the United States. There are also purposeful killings, which I don't need to go into. I know Professor Artinian talked about that, and probably also Professor Clinton, of tribal people throughout the colonial history of the United States. And then we had the War of 1812, which was basically, they were trying to get tribes to participate in the war on either side, the Americans, British, things of that nature. And actually there were a group of Choctaw Indians who participated with Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. And I think they probably regretted that because when Andrew Jackson became president, he signed the Indian Removal Act, which basically resulted in tribal people being moved from east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory. And so I tell you that because there were tribes who were east of the Mississippi who then came and sought refuge with our community in the bayous of South Louisiana. So we're basically an amalgamation of various tribes, not just our historic tribe and the bayou, but other tribes who were actually metal chiefs, had been recognized by foreign governments, who came and became part of our community. I think people, okay. This is from my community in 1930. So this is what Pointe-a-Chan looked like. This is a palmetto house. As you can see, it's a black and white picture, but just imagine that this is very green. So it was lush. And my mom was born in one of these palmetto houses, and she was born in the late 1940s. Our community was very self-sufficient and isolated. And I want to give you this visual because I think it's very important to juxtapose it against what we're dealing with today. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So around 1897, there was a decision made. And this was a decision made because some areas, when the Mississippi River would flow, there would be, water that would flood, and certain communities would be flooded, and those people who lived in some of those areas didn't want that to happen. So they decided that they wanted to control the Mississippi River. And I found this statement in an 1897 National Geographic magazine. And at the time, they recognized that the people who lived below where they were going to levee the Mississippi, that area would be destroyed from the lack of topsoil replenishment and from flooding. So who lives below this area of the Mississippi River? Yeah, so there are 6 indigenous communities in the state of Louisiana who live in this area, and at this time, when I found this, I was so upset, but they knew that this area would be flooded. They knew that there wouldn't be topsoil replenishment, and that people would eventually have to leave their homeland. So they also recognized, well, that could be prevented if there were other levees put in place. So over 100 years later, my community does not have any levees, but the communities to the east and west of Indian communities have levees. So, you know, that's one part of the story of environmental disaster, but it also results in basically termination of peoples if they don't have a place to live collectively as a community, and the ability to continue their culture. That was one part. The next part is that industry was allowed around the same time, around the 1930s when that picture was taken, to just overtake the land, oil and gas industry, to develop the land, do oil explorations. So this is my community, and people lived way down the bayou here, and then there's lakes here. People live all through here. Currently, people can only live here because there's so much saltwater intrusion. So these are decisions made by individuals in power. You know, we're going to dam up the Mississippi when before it was very fertile. Topsoil replenishment caused all this land to be replenished every year. And then we're going to allow industry to cut up the land so we have increased salinization and people can't live there anymore. So people who lived way down here have had to move, and so there's just a little ridge where people currently live. And so this, if you compare it to that earlier picture, this is what's happened to the trees. You know, everything's dead. You can't grow a garden. People were very self-sufficient, and people live off the water now, but they can't grow a garden or anything like that. I'm so sorry for what I'm doing. Why does this matter? You know, why is this important? Basically, because it's resulted in relocation and potentially future relocation. And this is an example of an oil company cut. It was a little cut, this land was contiguous, and now it's separated. And it's really important for us, though, you know, a normal person, you know, a person not from the community wouldn't know this going through there, but this is a mound. This is one of our sacred sites. And on the other side, it cut through a plaza where there's other burial mounds. And so for us, this is a loss of our culture and our community and our ability to protect these things. And not having the recognition from the government has really prevented us being able to protect that, because nobody cares about this 800-member community who lives in the water, because they're like, after a hurricane or anything, they're like, why do you live there? That's ridiculous, you know? Because people have their own judgments and they don't have understanding. And I think that recognition would not only equal respect and dignity and acknowledgement, but it also would provide those legal resources that are needed. Well, last year we had a conference here at ASU, and it was called Who Decides You're Real? Because the government, you know, has created this federal acknowledgement process, started in 1978. And, you know, in 1930, when that picture was taken, we were Indians, you know? When Indians weren't allowed to go to school because we were Indians, we were Indians. But now, you know, in 2015, we're not considered Indians in order to protect our land, because there's challenges. Who benefits from us not being able to protect this land? Who do you think benefits?
Oil companies.
Oil and gas.
American government.
American government, fish and wildlife. Everybody wants fish here. Good fishing, good crabs, you know. We don't have to deal with those Indians. So that, you know, those are some of the things that we have to deal with. But in the meantime, people still love it here. We still live here. And we've had some recent environmental challenges. I'm sure y'all have heard of Katrina and Rita. Hurricane Katrina hit around Mississippi, I mean, New Orleans flooded because they didn't have a levee that held, but we didn't even have a levee. Okay, and then with Rita hitting Galveston, which is about 300 miles away, and we had 8 feet of water in our community. And the same with Gustav and Ike. Gustav was right through our community. There were homes that you wouldn't even know a home was there because everything disappeared. And with Ike, we had 8 feet of water again. But because we weren't recognized, the government wouldn't deal with us. So the government would only deal with the parish or the state, who has no intention to work cooperatively with the state tribes. And then in 2010, we had a BP oil spill. I think we all heard about this. And our community was directly impacted. And so we coordinated right away to try to put out boom to protect some of our villages and sacred sites. And that was very important because at that time the U.S. Coast Guard worked with us. And even though we were in a very trying time, for the young people to be able to participate gave them a sense of hope, right? They felt like they were going to protect that sacred site or ground, even though in reality, if a hurricane would have came and brought that oil in, we would have been a Superfund site. But you know, one of the reasons is because we don't have a levee or anything like that. But the big issue is we're not being able to participate in the restoration process, and there's a lot of money involved in the restoration process, and there aren't any projects to put money south of where the tribes are. There's money through the restoration process that are going in other places, but they haven't deemed it important yet to put anything south of the tribes. And then also, we had to really fight for protection, or to be included in the discussion of protecting our sacred sites. And I think that's ridiculous. And people were very upset about that. During the BP oil spill, because the oil came in, it accelerated the marshland loss. And so there were actual bodies coming up on shore. And the federal government said, I can't consult with you because you're not a federally recognized tribe. I said, I don't care what you call it, but you have to talk to me. Okay? Now you can call it your whatever legal term, but you're going to have to talk to me. And so they had meetings, and then they had this huge meeting, and they excluded us. And so I called, is this being recorded? Yes. Okay. And so I called someone in the Department of Interior, and okay, that's okay. So I called someone in the Department of the Interior, and I said, you know, this is a problem because you're having meetings about, you know, sacred sites, and we're very concerned about that, and you've excluded us. And I'm not saying anything about making a threat, but I just want you to know that our tribal members have guns. They have used them before, because it's true. Whenever they try to cut through a sacred site in the past, I mean, these are very sensitive issues. And so we finally got a letter saying you're able to consult and things like this. But if we sit back and wait for them to recognize us, they're not going to say, oh, let us help you. Oh, we feel like you're such in need. They're not going to do that. You have to advocate for it. And, you know, and it's tiring for those people who have to go through it day by day. And I know that we're short on time, so I'll try to wrap this up. But I think that recognition is needed, you know, not just for the assertion of those legal rights, but also for the healing. And for our community, we have, unfortunately, over 100 years. And I think the way that the government is dealing with unrecognized tribes has become worse. And so I think it's that healing, understanding, and actually survival. So we're now at a point where we're on the edge of the water. There were decisions made by the Army Corps of Engineers not to include certain Indian communities in a levee system. So what does that mean? That means that community will disappear. Those communities are talking about relocation, but those communities want to relocate as actual communities. And I also want to mention there's been a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that was passed by the UN. The U.S. and other countries with indigenous peoples, 4 main countries, Western countries, did not support it initially, and now they support it. And within that, there are rights to self-determination, and those rights are basically other rights that are in other UN declarations that apply to all peoples, right? And the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous People found that the federal acknowledgement process inhibits tribes in the United States, those non-recognized tribes, from exercising all of those rights that are protected under the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. And also recently, the UN CERD Committee found that the federal acknowledgement process also limits these tribes, such as mine, from exercising those rights. So I'm very thankful that I was asked to speak today, and I think that the students have done a wonderful job bringing people together, and I feel like I have learned a lot of what's happening in other communities, and I just want to urge people to continue to fight and in a positive way and to support each other. And so thank you.
Next presentation is actually a group of 4 speakers. They are the creators of the creative collective 99 and Counting. 99 and Counting is a creative collective featuring the thoughts, opinions, and experiences of Armenians in the diaspora and non-Armenian advocates, providing thousands of readers with the opportunity to understand the relevance and the continued importance of the Armenian genocide. So, if you could welcome along with me Missak, Artinian, Melissa Lake, John Mardirossian, and Taleen Mardirossian.
Okay. When I first read the description of this panel, the 2 words that kind of stuck out at me was cultural revival and cultural rebirth. And I sat and thought about what I had to say about this topic. And I struggled. I really, really struggled. And I tend to be a quick thinker, and I tend to always know what I want to say and how I want to say it, so it drove me a little crazy that I couldn't come up with anything until I figured out why I was having such a hard time. And the reason was because how can you revive, or how could there be rebirth of something that was never dead? A year ago today, we were complete strangers. Except that John is my brother, so I knew him a little bit. But the rest of us didn't know each other, and we live in different parts of the country. John and I are from LA, Missak is from Virginia, and Melissa's from Boston. And we have a 5th writer who couldn't be here today, but she was studying at Oxford at the time in the UK. So between the 5 of us, some of us speak Armenian, some of us don't, some of us are half Armenian, some of us are full Armenian. Some of us have come from communities and been raised in communities where there are overwhelming a number of Armenians, and some of us come from places where there are absolutely no Armenians. Some of us have been to Armenia, some of us have lived in Armenia, some of us have never been to Armenia ever. So this group is all across the board. We come from very different backgrounds. We have 5 very different personalities. And when I say very different, I mean, like, I really mean it. We had a 6-hour road trip coming out here, and that just confirmed everything that we did for a year. But at the end of the day, there's one thing that connected us together. And that one thing is the fact that we all belong to a generation of people who were never meant to exist. And what I mean by that is that 100 years ago, when the Armenian genocide was being perpetrated, the intent was to annihilate an entire race, which means that they were trying to ensure the fact that there would be no descendants. Essentially, there would be no us. But our ancestors survived, and that is what we have in common. And so, can you imagine just for a second how strong of an impact a single event must have had in order for it to bring together a group of strangers 100 years later? And so it's been a year now. Last April, I put this group of writers together and we created a collective, and it's called 99 and Counting. And this is a website where we feature the thoughts and the opinions and the experiences of Armenians. And so we started writing. We wrote about identity and culture and what it's like to be raised an Armenian here in the US, and what it's like to belong to a diaspora and to be born outside of Armenia but still have this connection to something that somewhere we've never been growing up. How is this unfamiliar and unknown place such a big part of our lives? And so we wrote. And in addition to the things that we wrote, we received guest submissions from all over the world. From Oregon, from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, from Brazil, from Lebanon, from all over the place. I mean, even like cities we've never even heard of. But point being, Armenians have a lot to say. And these are not just the stories of our ancestors and of what happened 100 years ago. These are our stories. These are the stories of the new generation, the people who are still living the effects of the genocide. And so we published these stories and people read these stories, and we have seen the impact of these stories on readers, and Missak is going to tell you guys a little bit more about the content of our blog and the impact that it's had.
Hi everyone. As Taleen mentioned, I am from Virginia, and I actually remember when she first called me because it so happened that I had just moved to Los Angeles, actually this month last year. And when she called me and she was like, hey, I'm starting this project, and I was thinking that, you know, I've read your work and I was saying maybe you would want to partake, and I was like, okay, that sounds kind of cool, like what's it about? She's like, the Armenian genocide. And instantly I panicked, right? I was like, what am I supposed to say? I don't consider myself an authority on the subject matter of genocide, and I didn't feel as though I had anything to say anything that hasn't been said already. And so I gave Taleen a list of names of people who were more articulate and smarter and more charming than me, and she was like, no, Missak, I want you. And I was like, you know, I was very validated by that. You know, not since I got complimented on my eyebrows at a Starbucks have I ever felt that kind of validation. And so I was like, okay, fine. You know, you want me, and I'll write something. And I wanted to write about, I guess, my experience as living in Glendale, California, which I'm sure some of you might know is like the second biggest population of Armenians outside of Armenia. And I was like, okay, well, this might be an opportunity for me to kind of explore that identity struggle. And so, as a result, I wrote what is titled, it's an essay, a humorous piece called A Douchebag from Glendale. And in the essay, I document a little bit of my experience of talking to non-Armenians in Glendale about what their perceptions are about Armenians, and sometimes in a stealthy way in which I introduce myself as Mike. And so they don't know I'm Armenian because apparently I'm ambiguous ethnically, which works out like at TSA screenings apparently. But anyway, so in Douchebag from Glendale, I also talk a lot about like my identity struggle of living in Virginia, where I was surrounded by no Armenians whatsoever. And in that, whenever I would bring up the idea of like me being Armenian, I was met with like, oh, you know, you're mysterious and that's intriguing. Like, tell me more about what it's like to be Armenian. And that was also really positive for me because then I had an opportunity to set up a positive kind of idea of what an Armenian is. So it was like, you know, a huge burden on my shoulders, and I always tried my best to, you know, for better or for worse, start a good reputation for Armenians. But when I came to Glendale, on the other hand, things changed because I was automatically associated with car insurance fraud and all this other things like that. I had no responsibility over it. And so that's what the article more or less is about. And you know, I would suggest for everyone to maybe check out our blog. There's amazing pieces on there. And in fact, what was it called? Freshly Pressed, which is like a showcase of WordPress editors, decided to showcase, I'm saying that word too much, but they decided to display my article on their website. And after that, a whole bunch of people started coming to our website and commenting on all of our issues that we were bringing up. And that was really great. And I'd like to share a few of the comments that we received. This one in particular was on the douchebag from Glendale story. I'll read it. This is by a person named David Gonzalez. And he said, I shamefully am one of those people who view most Armenians that way. Reading what you wrote made me realize how wrong I've been. As a Hispanic male, I'm sorry for the people who view Armenians in such an awful way, and I'm sorry for being one of them shamefully. I came in reading this article and the comments of the article thinking I'd only see what I've always thought of Armenians, and I was completely blown away by how wrong I've been. So that was a very powerful comment because it goes to show you that there's a lot of people who really don't understand the Armenian experience, and sometimes injecting some humor, I think, really puts like a human face on our struggles. And that's something that I was very conscious of, like going in with my blog pieces. Another thing that I wanted to read, this is another comment on that article. So this person wrote, from an American point of view, most of us are ignorant. I like that many of the comments here encourage you to teach others about your culture and open the eyes of those who cannot understand because they do not share similar struggles. They need you more than they know. And that was the second validating thing of my entire life. After the eyebrow comment, and then Taleen was like somewhere like third. So okay, the next comment that we would like to talk about is another article that we received from a person named Medina, and she is an Afghan-American Muslim woman. And in her article, which is titled An Open Letter to Armenians, she kind of expressed her feelings about what it's like to live in a world in which people like the Turks who committed such an awful crime and who identify as Muslim are, you know, in like the discrepancy between her religion and like that. And so let me just read that because she says it better than I could. I remember first hearing the word genocide and the grief on your faces when you remembered. How shocked I was that this was not in our school books, not one page. I remember hearing that it was the Muslims who did it and how guilty I felt, knowing the same melodic call to prayer that brings me peace must bring you pain memories of your ancestral past. I know. That's why we're featuring that here. And so this was really powerful to all of us because it really underscored the fact that people who come from all walks of life can kind of find some common ground in all of our struggles. And so what we wanted to set out to do with our blog was to give a voice to the voiceless. And these are people who are expressing their real identities and their struggles. And then they're also learning something new out of it, like David Gonzalez or her, who had never really thought about the Armenian situation, or if she had, she wanted to express her own thoughts. So these were really poignant moments in this whole journey. And so I'd like to transition now to Taleen here, who unfortunately couldn't be with us because she's in Spain. But she did create a video in which she talks about like some of the poetry that she had contributed to our blog. So Go ahead.
Inhabit this sort of interstitial space where Armenia is home and not home, and the United States is home and not home. And so this poem is about that experience, and it's also about being a female poet and a female voice amongst a long tradition of very loud Armenian male literary voices. And it's called Homemaker. You may think I write to move you, but I write to move myself from one place to another. The words that are missing from this poem are somewhere else. The salt that is missing from the borscht is somewhere else. The mountains that are missing from Armenia are somewhere else. I'm a creator of nothing spectacular with the power of invisibility. I'm a homemaker at my writing desk. I'd like to emphasize that I began writing poems because I was so frustrated at this Armenian literary tradition of writing about genocide and of writing about Western Armenia and of writing about lands lost and people displaced. And I wanted to write about other aspects of the Armenian diaspora experience. I felt like there was this one aspect, a really traumatic aspect, that was sort of sucking all of the creative energy. And I felt like there were other aspects that really deserved attention. But the irony here is that in considering myself an Armenian writer, I inevitably write about genocide. And I think it's this trauma that's intergenerational that has prompted me to do so. So I always try to make the explanation shorter.
Sorry, we cut her off right as well. A big thing that we're focusing on today is Armenian culture and what it is today. So I'm a science major, so this is probably going to be kind of ridiculous, but this is called the cladogram, and it'll make sense. I'll kind of talk about it. An important part of saying Armenian culture has never died is to focus on its evolution. In biology, we determine the fitness of a species by its ability to adapt to and cope with its environment. And just like animals will experience the Darwinian survival of the fittest law of nature, cultures throughout society have come and gone, waxed and waned, morphing and changing with time, some continuing on while others are left to die. As a scientist, I'm inclined to draw parallels to the laws of nature, so Armenian culture was no different to me. I see our common ancestor, which is Armenia, a rich and concentrated culture exclusive to almost one singular area of the world, and I see its descendants, its gradual evolution and growth, its continued adaptations needed to survive in new environments. I see the branching from the original, the creation of different subfamilies within a greater species, and like its species in nature, while all share a similar common ancestor, while our basic foundations are from the same source, all different Armenian cultures had to individually adapt to and survive within unique environments. From my personal cultural experience, I was raised believing I was Turkish, while still knowing I was Armenian. Whether it be to spare a child from tales of horrific violence, the inability to speak of a wound still raw and painful, or the fact that the reason my family is here today is thanks to the kindness of Turkish strangers. My mother never really spoke to me of the genocide when I was young. So my youth was a mix of two conflicting cultures. I ate breakfast in a kitchen adorned with Armenian flags, but then talked about Turkey when people asked what my ethnicity my mother was. My mother never renounced her nationality, but also never abandoned her heritage. She was Turkish Armenian, just as American diaspora-born Armenians are Armenian American. But I think this cultural fusion speaks more for Armenian perseverance than it does of forced Turkish cultural assimilation. My mother and her family spent years hiding their true ethnicity, adopting a culture that had seen to the decimation of her own. And yet their root culture was not lost, it had simply changed, evolving in its latency. I find myself now, an adult, raised a part of two enemy cultures, proud to say I'm both, but also acutely aware that I'm Armenian by blood and by birthright, and a Turk only by genocide. And thus, I don't think it would be too bold to say that Armenian genetics are a dominant trait. Somewhere on one of our 46 chromosomes sits an allele unique to Armenians, and even through generational dilution, it still permeates as strong as ever. Even I stand up here today, half Turkish diasporan-born Armenian and half generationally American, that's my last name, raised in a town where I was the only Armenian, incapable of speaking the language of my ancestors, but more than aware that I am Armenian before I am anything else. And whether it be through generations of ethnic mixing or from sheer distance to an elusive homeland, this genomic marker still remains permanent and impervious to the effects of time and other evasive cultural interference. Armenians are a culture of people marred by tragedy and driven by strength. We are a culture of people who refuse to be forgotten, a people who refuse to be ignored and driven to obscurity. We are a culture that has not only survived through insurmountable strife and impossible odds, we are a culture that has come back from the systemic annihilation of our people stronger than we were before. You can drag us from our homes, you can burn us and rape us and reduce us to nothing. You can forcefully and coercively take the people out of Armenia, but you cannot, through any form of abuse or injustice or forced assimilation, take Armenia out of the people.
Melissa is an incredible writer, obviously. They really all are, though, and I really urge you guys all to visit our blog after this conference. Take a look at some of our content, leave us some feedback, keep in touch with us, let us know how we've been doing, and maybe even contribute. Now, we're not quite done yet, I'm sorry. I'm going to say a few things to finish up. Yesterday I looked at some of our stats to see how the blog's been doing lately, and I did so firstly hoping to impress you guys, first and foremost, but also for a second, more important reason that I'm going to get to. We started this blog, and in the first week of the blog being live, we had viewers in more countries than we had all collectively ever been to. And to date, we have a following in over 130 different countries around the world, and a viewership of over 60,000. So I believe we have done something significant here, and what I believe we've done is effectively create a link between a diaspora that's otherwise so heavily dispersed, and at the same time open up that link to different peoples and different cultures. Now, I grew up going to protests, and I grew up going to the rallies and the educational hearings, but this has always been very different for me. This has been more open, more interactive, more responsive. I've met people, Armenians and non-Armenians, that I otherwise never would have. I made contacts in cities that I've never been to. We have people sending us their thoughts, their ideas, their perspectives, giving us feedback, comments, commenting amongst themselves and discussing. We have people offering us suggestions on ways to expand our blog. We have people offering us help to expand our blog. People we've never met offering us whatever specific ability they have, anything they can do to make our blog bigger and better. And that's absolutely phenomenal that we're even getting that kind of support. And again, I know we've touched on people contributing and how important that's been to us. But I'm going to say one last thing. As the editor receiving these submissions, there's a really strange feeling that I get every time I do see one of these submissions. And it's hard to describe, but I'm going to try. It feels almost as if that piece of work that I get sent to me, it was almost as if it was written at some point in time before our blog was even created. But whoever did make that piece of work really didn't know what to do with it, almost as if they had nothing to do with it. So they put it on a shelf somewhere where it did nothing but collect dust. And until one day, that creator of the content found our platform and for whatever reason felt compelled to revisit that piece of work and felt some desire to share it on our site. And in doing so, managed to effectively give that piece of work purpose and bring it to life. And the fact that we can offer people the opportunity to do that is absolutely incredible to me. And the fact that we can offer our viewers access to this otherwise hidden information is absolutely incredible. Now, I gave you those stats because, like we said, we are 5 very different people with different abilities and different interests, different schedules and priorities, from different time zones too. And it was very hard to work on this blog, and we did so in our spare time. This has been a side project. We all have our own obligations. I work 60 hours a week. Melissa is going for her master's in pre-med. Missak just moved from Virginia and is starting a whole new life in LA. Taleen went through her last year of law school, and the other Taleen that you guys saw, she was writing her dissertation for her master's and just moved to Spain for a new job opportunity. So we come home late at night, half asleep, and somehow still managed to put a few hours into this project, and we've managed to make it this successful. And if we are able to do that, the 5 of us, under these completely unideal conditions, it really makes me wonder what our generation is capable of. If our generation were to collectively focus our abilities, our creativity, and our drive in any direction, really, it's almost unimaginable what we can accomplish. And the amount of activity and involvement we've seen from this blog is a testament to how active and receptive our generation is and how willing they are to move forward and make progress. Our culture isn't dead, it's very much alive, and it is going places.
And now we will welcome our final presenter for this session, which is Naira Kuzmich. She was born in Yerevan, Armenia, and raised in the Los Angeles enclave of Little Armenia. Her stories and essays can be found in the Three Penny Review, Warnica, West Beach, Ninth Letter, Blackbird, and elsewhere. Currently, she is earning her PhD in English at the University of Missouri.
This is titled Black Stone of Skin, Writing Armenian Woman's Grief. Imagine here, if you will, at the end of all this, the wail of the duduk, a low cry that stretches long, a dancer's hand reaching back and reaching forward, a weaver's thread pulled taut and trembling. Between one's fingers, within one's throat, between you and me, something taut and trembling. Please allow me to speak to you today about grief. On the eve of my grandfather's death, my mother sat at the kitchen table writing because I could not. My poet daughter, she gutted, where are your winning words? Yes, grief lives on the tongue, but I had swallowed mine long ago. Please allow me to speak to you today in my adopted language, to share with you what I know about grief, what years of being an Armenian daughter has bloomed inside of me. Here are my words. Hear me. My mother preparing her father's eulogy hours before that giant man took his last breath. Gone's my mother's word. Gone's aid, my mother's words in the church. My father, she had cried, you were a saint. At the kitchen table, my mother and her ripped out notebook paper, her ripped out heart. The pen in her hand, not a sword, but a shovel. Hours before he dies, my grandfather dead and buried between thin blue lines. My mother buried her father, and that's the way it is supposed to be. We are told that's the way it is supposed to be so that we may take comfort. But who can tell Armenians that destiny is alive anywhere other than the forehead, written on the bodies of our women, carved down in the black stone of our skin? I tell you, there is nothing romantic about death, about ceremonies, about widows, about orphans, about black dresses and covered mirrors, about coffee boiling and overflowing, about demi-tasse cups rattling in hands, cold from damp grass, cold from the sun's garden hose before entering his house to taste the taste of his flat bread, about incense making children sneeze, about the priest pocketing payment in his robe after he crosses himself with pinched fingers, about dirt under fingernails, about dirt under feet, dirt choking throats, dirt covering graves, one grave or 1.5 million graves, nothing romantic at all. When I began writing stories, I was really writing love letters to the women in my family. I am still writing love letters. I was and still am writing love letters to these women in English. I am writing eulogies. But I was eulogizing long before anyone I loved had died. I was writing eulogies for women I had only heard of. Myth women, myth mothers, myth martyrs. In my head, as long as I can remember, I have been eulogizing. I have been eulogizing in English. But in my heart, but Gons, my mother had said, Gons aid. And I sat there in the first pew, closest to that giant, giant man, so close I thought I could reach him if only I extended a hand. And my mother was saying, Gons, Gons aid. And her words reached everyone. When I began to write, I thought, I still think, I can make meaning of all this. That I can find the truth hidden from me since I was a child. My mother's hand letting go at the schoolyard. Anything lonelier than an immigrant child on the first day of school? My Bosnian fiancé tells me as a refugee in Germany of the black plastic bag his mother had given him, filled with pencil and paper. No time nor money yet to buy him a backpack. The plastic bag swinging in his hand, twisting, twisting, crinkling. His teacher introducing him as the boy from the country that no longer exists. And I think yes when I kiss him, and no, I think no. I can't quite understand what that feels like. My family left our country because things were difficult. No electricity, no warmth in our beds, no unrationed bread. Difficult. But my family didn't leave our country because men with guns hated our last name. Not then. And so yes, I kiss my partner again on the mouth, and I think, I do know. I have always known. Since I began to write fiction 7 years ago, my maternal grandmother has lost a husband and a sister. The first story I ever wrote was about a modern-day Turk and Armenian falling in love, marrying, but struggling over the idea of having children. This was my first and last story centered explicitly about the genocide. Explicitly, I tell you. The second story I ever wrote was based on my maternal grandmother, based on all the years she nursed her ailing loved ones. In the story I wrote, my grandmother is the one who dies first. In the story I wrote, I felt that this was the truest ending of all. Not right, no, not right, not just, but true, inevitable. Of course she died first. Of course she's still dying. Of course she was dead from the beginning. When I asked my grandmother about her marriage to her husband, my grandfather, that Gons, that giant, giant man, she says this. She says, I suffered no pain under my husband's hand. I married on a Saturday, and on Wednesday his father fell ill. I looked after him. He would dirty his bed. He would wear long white underwear. It would become very, very dirty. One night I woke to the sound of my baby crying. I woke to find the old man sticking his fingers in my son's eyes. I yelled for my husband. He woke and cradled his father back to bed. My baby's eyes were swollen for days. When I interrupt to ask, didn't Papi say anything to his father? Like, what was he doing? What was he thinking? She says this first. What was there to say? And then she says this. The old man's first wife and children were killed during the genocide. That doesn't justify it, I tell her. That cannot. My grandmother sighs. He sometimes forgot where he was, who he was. Sometimes he didn't recognize anyone at all. Fine, I say, him. But what about your husband? Why didn't he do anything to help you? Why were you cleaning up after his father, you who were just a new bride? I was 21, she answers, as if that explained everything. In the second story I ever wrote, my grandmother dies cleaning her husband's shit from her hands. I will admit that all of my writing is a false start. When I write, I am singing my Armenian womanhood to whomever might listen. I am dancing a dance about losses I am only just beginning to understand. I am repeating myself, filling my body and the page with all of the same notes. Our mothers are our martyrs. What I really want to say is simply, I love you, but instead, I kill and kill again the women I create, an image of the women I love. And I know why I do it, why I feel I must. I do it for you, my audience, so that you may feel the depth of my love, the depth of my grief, how mysterious it is. Please do not ask me to use plural pronouns. It is it and not they. Grief and love. Who was the madman who separated the two? For it cannot be a woman who divided the child from the mother, who pulled the child from the depth of her mother's darkness. It rages in the bottomless well of my heart. But I do it for me too. And some of you may have also felt the plastic bag twisting in your hand. Something in you may understand the pleasure in grieving when you know you can stop it, when you know you can control it, when you can turn the page, erase a few phrases, take back the words to I love you, and stop the pain from becoming real. For I am the narrator in all of my stories. I am the one who steps back and says the end. Or maybe I should have said this about my grandmother, that the first time her own mother visited her in her marital home, her sick father-in-law threw a glass of water at her back. My grandmother says her mother was hurt by the sight of it. She went to stay with her other married daughter that night. That is, my grandmother says, when her mother first began her long dying. And my grandmother's sister, you wonder, this other married daughter, my grandmother's sister buried her child to breast cancer, and then her husband to heartbreak, and spent the last years of her life dirtying herself and unable to recognize anyone. My grandmother did for her what she had always done. She had loved her. When my great aunt died, I learned from her eulogy for the first time that their mother was orphaned by the genocide, sold to a local Arab, years later rescued by British missionaries, married off at 19, widowed at 19 and a half. The eulogy went on and on like this, and I'm glad someone remembered it, that they told it in this order, first this, then that, because now I can sit back and I can rearrange the pieces and pretend I can change the course of her life and the meaning of her death. But despite from which angle I look, from where I start or how I end, the story is still the same. The women I loved were always dead from the beginning. When I began to write, I wanted to do with words what men have done for centuries with aged apricot wood. What do I know about grief? I, a child, I understand instinct as only a child understands instinct. I understand that grief is the cause and the effect, the mother and child of tradition. Grief is love meets loss. Grief is the child pulled from the depth of her mother's darkness. Because Armenians have loved life too much, loved each other too much, because Armenians have survived when they should not, we have always grieved. Our mothers have loosened us from their wombs so that we may live. And what greater purpose to that life, I ask you, than to acknowledge the gravity of their loss, their pain at having to watch us go into a world less safer than theirs, to sit and cry alongside them. Our grief did not start with 1915, it did not start with 1894. You cannot date what is written down in the black stone of your skin. I am a tree, just cut me down and try to measure the depth of my love. What lies at the heart of my people's engagement with grief, what lies at the heart of me, circles, just try to find a beginning or an end. Or maybe I should have said this about my grandmother, that when she was nursing her ailing husband, that giant, giant man, that Gons, he would upset her. He'd want water when his lungs were already overfilling with it. He'd want food when his body could no longer stomach it. He'd want to stay on his back in his own filth, even though they still shared the same bed. I'd sometimes get angry, my grandmother says, but I was always so good. My grandmother remembers one moment in particular. She is mad at him, mad, 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 and he looks deeply into her eyes and asks, "My wife, where was your tongue back then?" An old myth remembered in an old book. To cure one's fear, an Armenian had to find the gravestone of someone either long forgotten by those from their village or someone struck dead by lightning. He would wash his hands and face with water from a glass that rested briefly on top of the stone, and then he would break that glass against the rock, transferring his fear onto the dead person. For the people of Armenian lands, lightning was rare, but rarer still was the man or woman forgotten by their village, even years after their death. So tell me, just what were those afraid to do? No, grief is not in me, and it is not in you, but it is in us. As a people, it is in us. The things I want to say about my mother, I cannot bear to write. I don't have the words just yet. Know that she is mad, mad, mad too, but she too swallowed her tongue long ago. Now she only rages at death when he's there in a casket, staring her in the face with his eyes closed. But please, imagine her hands. She once played the piano, the violin. When I tell her that her hands are still beautiful, she says the same thing. My hands are like my mother's, the same thing. History counts its losses, but I say, one dead woman from the beginning, all my loved ones dead. Or maybe this. My grandmother tells me that when she moved into the marital home, she had to bring almost everything herself. Her dowry included bed, linens, dressers. They had nothing, she says. So she tells me a story about instinct. One day, that Wednesday when her father-in-law first falls ill, after the shock, after the fear, there is only instinct. She realizes that the old man will have nothing to wear to his grave. She tells her husband to invest in a small pig. They will feed it, and it will grow, and it will bring them much money when it fattens. Her husband, that gons, listens. But the pig they buy is sick too, sick from the beginning, and dies much too quickly. They sell it for what they can. With the money, she tells her husband to buy his father a nice suit. It hangs in the dresser until the old man dies, and then she brings it out and dusts it off. I was so young, I didn't know what I was doing, my grandmother says. But I thought of that. Grief is our only weapon and our one true burden. We fight against it, and we fight for our right to feel it. And not just on one day, not on April 24th, not when a body is being buried, not for a week, not for 40 days, not for a year. I'm telling you, circles. My people, are you tired of my pronouncements yet? But isn't this what you've come for? Something true, something pithy, something you can put on your gravestone. Grief is the soul of our sensibility as Armenians, shaped by our history and preserved best in the histories of our women. Grief may not be particular to Armenians, but we have always believed it to be the case, that this was ours. And yes, what greater tragedy than wanting to claim grief for oneself, for wanting to control it, for thinking you can ever be prepared, for thinking that if you never stop grieving, there won't be a new thing to begin grieving for. I ask you, what better example of our humanity than our hopefulness in the face of our helplessness? Grief is in our language. It is in our terms of endearment. Who says such silly things as yes sirumem kez or I love you? Which Armenian has ever said anything other than hokit mernem or I will die to save your soul? It is in our dances, in our hands that come together then fall apart, our hands reaching back always before reaching forward. It is in our poetry. It is Bayur Sebak saying Barzapes matne behesirahavel. Simply with us, it is death who has fallen in love. And it is in the wail of the duduk, that aged apricot wood. When I write, I try to infuse my English words with this very non-English sensibility. I try to create lines from all of my circles. I want to call attention to the foreignness of this pain, the inevitability of this pain, the memory of this pain, of all the pains I have not experienced, but I have felt. I feel to be true. I read on the black stone of my skin. This pain I feel cannot be explained by one grave or 1.5 million graves. It cannot be explained by one woman's story or 3 women's stories. It cannot be explained. I'm tired of explaining. I'm tired, but still I cannot stop. How can I stop when my life has just begun? How can I stop when there are still so many women left to love and to bury? Do you want to know what hurts me most in this life? When no one can hear my cries, when no one tries to put a stop to them. This is one of the reasons why I believe the genocide is such a rallying point for Armenians across the globe, but particularly for Armenian artists and writers. We know we have to suffer the weight of this pain, but we refuse to suffer in silence. We refuse to make silent what speaks to us so clearly. We refuse to accept that humanity has closed her ears to our cries, to our songs, to every single one of our words. I am telling you that we have many tongues. If we swallow one, another rises from the back of our throats. If it is our fate to suffer as a people, then we must continue to love as loudly and grieve as long as it takes. Hear me. I am eulogizing in English, but I am reaching for all of you in Armenian.
Thank you for all of these wonderful presentations. I am inspired and energized listening to them. If I could get all of the presenters to come up here, I will try to step off to the back a bit. We've got a large group, so. We have a few minutes for Q&A. Thankfully, the other sessions were a little on the late side too, which is great for us. And I will just try to stay in the back so I can see hands that are up. And we have one right here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Bohnee, my question is to you. It is sad to what happened to the Indian communities. I am shocked and surprised why we don't hear of your plight more often, where we, full disclosure, I'm Armenian, we have this loud noise that we make about the Armenian genocide. Can you comment on that, please?
Well, thank you for being here, and I was so glad to be asked to be here, and I think part of the reason was to share my story. I think because we're small and not recognized, that's why people don't really hear about us. And when there are disasters, you know, there are larger communities that are impacted than us. And I think that's another reason. And because a lot of our tribal members only started going to school in the early 1970s because of segregation, so a lot of our people only speak French. So they haven't been very active politically and you know, involved in movements. Most people are fishermen and they live in the community. So I think that's probably the main reason, because of our isolation.
I think that many of the writers touch on the fact that grief is something that we as Armenians incorporate into our writing, and that this is something that stems obviously from just being Armenian and the genocide. Do you think there will ever be a point where as a people we would stop writing about this grief? Or is it just very ingrained in us? Or I would just be interested in hearing everyone's opinion on that. Naira and 99 something, so that'd be great.
I think there's like a difference in what I call maybe genocide narratives and what I have hopes for, like the future of Armenian American literature. And I think Taleen spoke to that issue a little bit. But I think kind of like the slavery issue for the African American population, you can have contemporary literature that falls under the umbrella of slavery literature, because everything that Black Americans write today is a result of slavery. And in a similar way, we can have, as like modern Armenian writers, we can grapple with other issues. We can grapple with, car insurance fraud and our reputation, and virginity issues, masculinity issues, our predisposition towards homophobia. We can tackle all of those things and still kind of fall under the umbrella of genocide literature or Greek literature, because the reasons we are writing in English or in French or in Turkish is because of the genocide. So inherently, everything is kind of post-genocide narrative, post-genocide literature. And we don't need to have like an explicit category or genre of non-genocide narrative or non-genocide style. I think it's intrinsically part of our language, the way we use our language, and the content of our work.
We have time for one more question. So I know that the 99 Counting hasn't spoken to. Do we have any questions in particular for them? Or,
I can ask them a question. I think it's fantastic, the passion that I see in your speeches, and I want copies of them, if you have them. How do you ignite that passion in a lot of other Armenian youth like you that are within the United States that I don't necessarily see in all? How did you guys get the passion, and how do we pass that passion along to them to continue, repeating or communicating, educating about the Armenians and our history?
I think that creating this blog, what I've learned is that a lot of younger Armenians have it in them. I think it's a matter of really reaching out, because people have things to say. We've received submissions, and there are submissions that these submissions weren't written after somebody found our blog and thought they wanted to express these ideas. There are people that submitted things that were written, like John said, a year ago, 2 years ago. And that means if you're writing about something, that means you feel something. There's something there. So when you're sharing that, I feel like a lot of the people that contributed, from speaking to them, I think that that spark came out when they posted something and they received feedback from other Armenians. Because before this blog, a lot of the submissions, like John said, it's just on a shelf somewhere and it's sitting there. But if somebody's already writing about it, or if you're reaching out to people and telling them, hey, we have this project, you live in a diaspora, do you have something to say? And a lot of times they do. But it's just a matter of, I think, the younger generation reaching out to each other, because it's there.
How are you getting your blog out? How are you getting it out to the youth?
Mostly Facebook and social media and word of mouth.
Word of mouth, a lot of word of mouth.
A lot of word of mouth.
We're too old to figure that out. They know what they
we need to conclude at this time, but I want to both thank the presenters, but also invite you all to speak to them individually or in small groups afterwards, because I think there is a few minutes for a break before the next session.